All right. Hi, everybody. Welcome to our asynchronous class for the week of January 27th. I hope that you're all doing well and that if you have any questions about this video, once you've had a chance to watch it, please reach out and let me know. So the first thing that we're going to do today is kind of like an overview of the plan for this video. So essentially, we're going to start with a recap from last week and from our last live class. And then we're going to dive right into the Pop Justice article. The Pop Justice article that you were assigned for this asynchronous video has two purposes. So the first is the substantive content, or the things related to the course that you'll learn from the reading, so related to the power and effects of popular culture, essentially. And then the second part of the Pop Justice reading is that this reading is a really good model for what the final project in this course will look like. It contains all of the different sections, and we're going to break them down one by one. Now, some of these sections are also relevant for your proposal, but please note that there are differences between the proposal and the final project. And it's important that those distinctions are clear. And so we're going to talk about that as we move through the semester together. For now, focus on the elements that are relevant to the proposal itself in terms of like how to structure a proposal for our class. All right, so we've got our popular culture vocabulary. We're building that as we move through the first part of our semester together. And in the live class, we added the concept of celebrity to this vocabulary, to our key list of definitions and concepts. We talked about what makes someone a celebrity, which is closely related to the definition of what a celebrity is. Now, a celebrity, or the concept of celebrity, is linked very closely to the word celebration, which refers to honoring or observing someone or something that is notable. We also saw in our live class the connection between celebrities and their fans, because arguably one cannot exist without the other. So in order to have celebrities, scholars have said you also need to have fans or an audience, and audiences or fans need to have something, in this case celebrities, that they can kind of latch on to and follow and be interested in. We also talked about how what constitutes a celebrity evolves over time. So because the definition of a celebrity has evolved over time, as well as in different places and in different cultures, that means that who is a celebrity or who can be a celebrity also evolves over time. Littler, in her article on celebrities, or in her book chapter on celebrities, examined a couple of different ways to understand how we identify a celebrity. And she relied on Dyer's 4 motifs of celebrity. So these motifs are ordinariness, extraordinariness, luck, and hard work. So Dyer said that celebrities can be classified along a spectrum of these 4 attributes or characteristics. And so what you could do as a potential study is classify celebrities along this spectrum. Ordinariness and extraordinariness are on the same line, and hard work and luck are also on the same line. And so you could track a celebrity's career over time along these spectrums, plotting the different events that occur in their life, or you could classify and identify different celebrities in that way. And The Rock I was talking about in our live class, I think, is a good example of a celebrity who embodies all of these different characteristics. I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about where he would fall on the spectrum, and arguably he might fall in different places at different times in his career, but certainly the quotes that are on these images that come from The Rock himself embody or convey ordinariness or luck. So that could be another way to study celebrities. You could say, okay, I wonder if The Rock, as an example of celebrities, is more ordinary or extraordinary, more luck or more hard work. And you could potentially track all of his media quotes or media appearances and try to classify him into these categories, or again, place perhaps a trajectory on a spectrum over the course of his career. And it's important to keep in mind that when you're studying celebrities or any form of popular culture, and we talked about the different ways that that's been done in the live class, that we think about the why. So the why does it matter? And that why may not be clear until you get to the end of your research project. You'll have some ideas about why it's important when you're proposing your research, but you may not be able to articulate or explain the actual importance of your project until you get to the end and you've analyzed your results. But we should have, by the time we've completed several of the components of our research proposal, an idea of where we expect this research to go and why it could be important. So keep that in mind when you're preparing your research proposal. There is a relevance component where you kind of predict what you think you're going to find and what you think the contribution of your research will be to the larger field of popular culture. So all of this brings us to today's video, which is about measuring and studying the effects of popular culture. So while we're still going to be building our pop culture vocabulary, we'll add some new concepts from this video. We're also switching our focus now that we have a good understanding, a shared understanding of what popular culture is, what some of the key concepts are, and what some of the critiques or criticisms are of this concept as a whole and of this field of study generally. If you think about mass culture, that is certainly a critique of popular culture. We're going to start thinking about this why does it matter? Why do we study popular culture? What are some of the important pieces? Now, the Pop Justice reading, just to give you a bit of background, is a systematic review. So that answers a defined research question. They collect and summarize all kinds of evidence that fits their pre-specified eligibility criteria. And we're going to talk about that more in the methodology section when we unpack that together. But just keep in mind a few things. A systematic review is not the same as a literature review. In your projects, you're asked to do a literature review, not necessarily a systematic review. And we'll talk about that a bit more. But essentially, a systematic review is a type of research methods that you can use in a research project. A literature review, on the other hand, is found in every single research project, research proposal, or even paper or chapter that we look at. Every single reading that we do together has some kind of literature review. Now, with all that said, as kind of like a caveat, the Pop Justice Report is a really, really great example of what a final paper in this class could and should look like. There are some exceptions. Their research was conducted over a larger period of time. They used many more resources than you guys are expected to use for their literature review. But the overarching structure is very similar. And that's what we're going to break down today. So the takeaways from this video can be split into two. One is the substantive content, so the actual course material that we learn from the Pop Justice article. And the other is that this paper is a really good model for your own projects in this class. And that's why we're going to spend so much time breaking down every single piece. So let's start with the introduction. So the introduction or abstract, and there is a small distinction between the two, but we're going to kind of lump them together. You don't need to have an abstract. You need an introduction. What this section should do is provide an overview of your study, why it's important, and what you've set out to prove. And that's what the introduction in the Pop Justice article does. And so this is taken right from their reading. Now, the first thing that the authors do is explain what it was that sparked their interest in this topic. So they draw a connection right away based on stereotypes and American culture. And they're like, hey, we've observed that there seems to be a lot of stereotypes in American popular culture. And we're interested in how popular culture can introduce more accurate portrayals of people of color and immigrants rather than stereotypes. So that's the why. That's why they chose to research this topic. The next thing they do is they talk about the how. So they talk about the methodology that they used, and they summarized it in less than a sentence. Here they say, we reviewed a group of academic studies and research reports to evaluate our hypothesis. So their hypothesis we're going to talk about in a second, but they've essentially defined what a systematic review is in their introduction in less than a sentence. The next thing they did in their introduction was actually lay out what their hypotheses were. So they had two. This is what they're setting out to prove or disprove. Now, as a caveat, in the social sciences and in popular culture, and we'll talk about this also over the course of the semester, it's very hard to prove or disprove something. And that's because popular culture doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we like to use words like support. We talk about correlation instead of causation, usually in our studies. So the authors put forward two hypotheses. The first one was that popular culture can be an effective instrument for positive social change. And the second was that it can be harnessed to challenge stereotypes and improve attitudes towards people of color. So that's what they were setting out to prove or study in their research project. Now, the last thing that the authors did in their introduction is explain why it matters. So this is the justification for their research. This is the policy implications or the rationale for undertaking this project. And it's different than their why statement at the beginning. They say this topic is important to study because popular culture is often the primary or only source of information that some people have about other racial or ethnic groups. And we've seen that theme explored earlier in our course in the concept of tourism, for example, where the images that we get or the experiences that we get as a tourist or through tourism could be our only source of information about that place or that time or that culture. So we're seeing that trend or theory being applied to stereotypes and identity groups here in the Pop Justice article. The next section of the Pop Justice paper is their literature review section. So a good literature review provides foundation, an overview of the existing knowledge on this topic. Essentially, it identifies areas of prior research in order to prevent duplication. It also gives credit to other researchers, and it does this by identifying inconsistencies, gaps in the research, conflicts in previous studies, and open questions left from other research projects. So taking a step back, when you think about research, not just in the field of popular culture, but in all fields of academic study. So quite literally in pretty much all of your classes that you're taking at the University of Ottawa. Think about research or any topic as like a 1,000-piece puzzle, if not more than 1,000 pieces. Every single study adds a new piece to this puzzle. And it's only at the end of the puzzle that we get like a full picture of the topic and we can say that we're experts in it. And it's possible that this puzzle is never completed. Maybe it starts as a 100-piece puzzle and then it expands to a 1,000-piece puzzle. And we'll see this in the context of the CSI effect, for example, which we're looking at in a few classes. But a literature review builds on previous areas of study. So this means you don't want to do the exact same study as somebody else, which is why you conduct a lit review. And there's something to learn from all of the studies that come before us. And these studies together allow us to see as researchers what research needs to be done next. So at the end of a literature review, and even in an annotated bibliography, we should be able to identify gaps in the research, highlight conflicts, so differing opinions in previous studies, and identify open questions left from other research. The literature review section leads to your research question. A good literature review contains arguments and counter-arguments and counter-arguments. And we're going to highlight those things in many of our readings that come after this video. In the Pop Justice article, the literature review section begins with, why popular culture? A key principle in research and in the literature review is to define your variables. This is why we spend so much time on definitions in our class. It helps to explain what you're measuring or what you're assessing in your field. So here, one of the concepts that the Pop Justice article is looking at is popular culture. And so they provide a definition of popular culture. Their definition is the elements of culture that are capable of sustaining and perpetuating themselves based on endorsement and participation by large groups of people through their own agency. So we're seeing some similarities with some of the definitions that we looked at together in our first class. For example, the quantity piece is there. Now there's a difference between defining something and providing examples of something. And so they also do that. They qualify what they mean by this definition. By specifying examples, they're able to better explain what it is that they're talking about. So they talk about some examples of the media of pop culture. So television, film, music, the internet. They say that popular culture is expressed through major forms of entertainment. So first they define it and then they explain it. But popular culture is just one of the definitions or one of the concepts that these authors are relying on. They do have others as well. And how you can figure out what terms you need to define comes from your research questions. So very often your research questions will have keywords in them that will need to be defined from the literature review, or your hypothesis or hypotheses will have these key concepts in them also. And so you need to make sure that those concepts are clear. It's going to help your readers be on the same page as you move forward in your report or your project. It's also going to ensure that your teammates are on the same page so that you guys all understand what it is that you're measuring or assessing. And finally, it's going to help you measure or assess those things. So that brings us to other definitions that these authors included. And so one of the concepts, the other concept that they're measuring is social change. So here they say that social change is an improvement in the state of affairs around a social issue at the individual, group, or system level. And they go on to link the two concepts, stating that they found some support in the literature to suggest that popular culture can be an agent for social change generally. And this is what this section and the rest of their literature review, or the next section at least, of their literature review is all about. So their first hypothesis is addressed first. And their first hypothesis was that popular culture can be an agent for social change. So it has the ability to influence social change. And they start to explain, based on existing research, why this is the case. So it allows us to have enjoyable emotional experiences with other characters, places, or things that we might not otherwise experience. It's dynamically expressive and very accessible. So it draws us in, and because it is so widespread, it's very common and easy for people to run into or to experience popular culture. In addition, popular culture helps us to define our social reality by identifying our group and individual identities. And so we have both group and individual identities, and we're going to talk about that in a later class when we do the Grossberg reading. But essentially, popular culture illustrates behavioral norms and social boundaries, and it helps us by demonstrating or depicting group rituals. And a great example where we see this is actually in the film Mean Girls.
Here, this map is going to be your guide to North Shore. Now, where you sit in the cafeteria is crucial because you got everybody there. You got your freshmen, ROTC guys, preps, JV jocks, Asian nerds, cool Asians, varsity jocks, unfriendly black hotties, girls who eat their feelings, girls who don't eat anything, desperate wannabes, burnouts, sexually active band geeks, the greatest people you will ever meet, and the worst. Beware of the plastic.
So a bit satirical, but this clip from Mean Girls helps to illustrate that popular culture can identify or at least show us different identity groups that exist. So it shows us in groups, so us, and them, out groups as well. In addition, it can also teach us about intergroup dynamics. So popular culture, as seen through Mean Girls, teaches us about how groups react. And it's so powerful because it's reliable, relatable, and accessible. And this brings us to the second hypothesis proposed by the authors in the Pop Justice article, which is that popular culture can be a tool for social change. So they show through their reading of existing literature that popular culture has been linked with the creation of negative opinions and negative stereotypes towards a specific group of people. And in the case of the Pop Justice article, they're interested in looking at a specific group of people, which is immigrants and people of color. And we see this, for example, in film and television when we think about the portrayal of villains in popular culture. So this idea of the bad guy du jour. Why does it matter? So popular culture, as shown in the research, can perpetuate negative stereotypes. It does this by making them readily available. Because it can perpetuate stereotypes on screen, in books, in music, that in turn shapes our behaviors and attitudes towards these so-called outgroups. But the authors of this article say, wait a second, if popular culture can create or perpetuate negative stereotypes, maybe more authentic, so more non-stereotyping representations can create positive perceptions of outgroups. And that's the hypothesis that the authors are interested in exploring or testing. So they say that popular culture can be used to change the narrative. In this way, it can be a site of resistance for challenging societal or social dominant norms. So we're coming back to this idea of ideology and hegemony, and that popular culture is a site of resistance, like we saw in some of our first readings in the class. And I think that the images on screen are perhaps a good example of this. So the first image is of a fictional character named David Palmer, who was president in the series 24 in 5 seasons from 2001 to 2006. He was portrayed as a strong, competent, smart, energetic, determined, responsible leader in 2001 to 2006. Barack Obama, another strong, smart, energetic, confident leader, was elected in 2008. And he was the first African-American president in real life in the United States. You could argue that by having such a strong African-American leader in 24, a very popular, well-watched television series for 5 years, that allowed people to change their perceptions or to become more comfortable with the idea of an African-American leader off screen, which could have not caused, but contributed to Barack Obama's election in 2008. It's a hypothesis that you could explore. It will be difficult to explore it because of the nature of popular culture and because there are certainly other factors in the universe that influence our behavior and identity. But this could be a test that you could run, some kind of experiment that you could run to figure out if popular culture does have an impact. Again, the authors say that popular culture matters, and these questions matter because representations that we see on screen, in books, in music, on the internet, could be our only form of contact with a specific group of people. And stereotypes become a way to categorize groups of people. So if the representations that we encounter are stereotypes, or if we encounter no representations at all of certain identity groups, these portrayals or lack thereof become ingrained in our own mental representation of a group, and they influence how we behave towards others and how we react to these groups. And so if we can reverse this by having positive representations, maybe popular culture can function as a tool for social change. And that's what the authors are exploring. So once they set the stage for what they're looking at, how they define their concepts, and why it matters, they go on to explain their methodology. So they explain how they actually conducted their research project. In your proposal, you're going to propose a plan for carrying out your research project. Cassidy, Erica, and I will provide you guys with some feedback on that to help maybe narrow your focus or be a bit more precise. Or if you have any questions about that, we'll help to address that in our feedback on your actual project. So in the proposal, it is, we will do this, we plan on doing this. And then in the project, it's very retrospective. We did do this. And so this is the author's "we did do this" section. Essentially, they engaged in a systematic review of existing literature from a range of perspectives related to popular culture. So they explain where they obtained their sources. They looked at the fields of media psychology, social psychology, mass communications and mass media studies, pop culture studies, which, as you can see, they say is a division of cultural and critical studies. It actually intersects several disciplines, as we've seen so far. And they also looked at other non-academic studies. So they looked at public health communications, for example. Now, in addition to this information, the authors could have and should have provided additional details about how they found the articles they chose to review. So what keywords or concepts did they use? What time period did they pull their articles from? Did they focus on 2000 to 2010? The time period matters because research evolves. So if they're looking at only studies from the 1960s, perhaps those studies aren't relevant anymore, or perhaps they don't answer the specific research questions that they were interested in exploring. So the time period is important in a systematic review. And they also could have explained how many papers they reviewed. We're going to see another systematic review later on in the semester when we look at the CSI effect. And I'd like you to think about some of the differences between the level of detail that's provided in the methodology section. And think about that in the context of your own research project. This is because a key aspect of research, even a systematic review, is replicability. We need to be able to test or validate existing research that comes before ours. We don't have that here, unfortunately. Now, what's a systematic review? Essentially, a systematic review answers a defined research question or hypothesis by collecting and summarizing all the evidence based on certain criteria. Again, this is where knowing how the authors found their article would be really helpful. The procedure for conducting a systematic review is similar to the procedure for conducting other types of research. The first thing you need to do is come up with your research question or hypothesis and think about whether or not a systematic review is the right tool that should be used. Then you need to develop your research protocol. So what keywords are you using? What time period are you using? What disciplines are you looking at? You do your search, select your studies, because not all of them will be relevant. Pull out your data, analyze your results, and interpret your results. Every method has its own procedure that is similar to that, but targeted to the research design in question. Now, the authors did identify some of the limitations of their study. They chose to identify the limitations in their methods section. In your final project, you've been asked to think about that in your conclusion section, because your methods will, your limitations will impact future areas of study, or they could. So the first challenge that they found from a methods perspective is that it's hard to translate, summarize, and really compare all of the literature that they found. And this is because popular culture spans several disciplines, uses several methodologies and different mediums. And so not every discipline has the same definitions. If you're using it across different mediums, you're analyzing different types of texts or different types of audiences, that can have an impact on your research project. The other limitation that they found is that it was hard to make generalizations, so implications, because individual studies are generally on one phenomena in one particular medium. And the CSI papers that we're going to be looking at later is an example of that. They all really look at one particular aspect, one particular text, so CSI, but you'll see that there are ways to raise implications and potential important areas of research or findings that could be relevant. Now, your research proposal will include predicted findings, but this is really where your proposal stops. Your final project, once you've actually carried out the study, will have findings. So again, your research proposal or the midterm for this class could have predicted findings, so what you expect to find, but you won't have actual findings because you won't have done the data collection piece yet. And we're going to talk about that. Okay, so what were the findings from the Pop Justice article? So the first thing they did is they identified all of the research that's being done in this area. they looked at the different methods that are used. And this table, which you can find in the Pop Justice article, is a really good starting place for your own methodology section, both in the proposal and in the final project. It goes through several, not all, but several different methods that are used in the field of popular culture. And it evaluates the pros, so the benefits of using any of these methods, that's the what it does or what they do section, and the cons. So some of the limitations that you may encounter if you choose to do, say, content analysis or audience surveys, for example. The Pop Justice authors found that there's a wide variety of research being done in this area and different methods. Now, they chose to limit their review to experimental studies, so to experiments. And this is a delimitation. They chose to limit their own study because what they were most interested in is the relationship between media content and audience perceptions on a specific topic. And this specific topic for the Pop Justice article was the influence of popular culture on how people feel about people of color and immigrants. So the relationship between the messages and the effects that are happening. And again, think about this during our time together this semester. What method are the research projects that we're looking at, or the articles or book chapters that we're looking at, using? Now, the next thing that the authors did, so the first thing they did was they explained existing research and the type of studies that they focused on. The next thing that they did was examine all of the findings of these other research projects. That was their findings section because they chose to do a systematic review. So they found that popular culture presents facts in an entertaining way. It also has the capacity to connect people on an emotional level. So based on existing research, they found that popular culture portrays outgroups, so groups that are different from us, in their full humanity, with the hopes of the audience recognizing that we're all the same. This triggers emotions with an audience. So think about your own experience with popular culture. Have you cried or screamed or laughed while watching or reading something? And because popular culture can trigger some kind of emotional reaction, it can also generate empathy. In addition, popular culture provides a vicarious practice or experience. So it allows us to carry out some kind of behavior because we can witness it and experience it on screen. It's also an opportunity for indirect contact. So where actors can serve as role models, and the more that we identify with them, the more we can relate to them. And they go through different types of contact that popular culture facilitates. Now, when these forms of direct or indirect contact are positive or occur with likable people, they improve our perceptions and attitudes towards those people. Similarly, when these forms of indirect contact are negative or occur with people who are not likable, they would have the opposite effect on our perceptions and attitudes towards those people. So this is what popular culture does. How does it do it? It does it through storytelling. So it involves a level of transportation, and that occurs through a narrative involvement. And that's critical for affecting change. Good popular culture that can be used to change perceptions and attitudes on social issues pull audiences in rather than pushing messages at them. So this way, viewers, readers, listeners don't feel like they're being sold something. And the authors noted that there's a fine balance between captivating an audience and disseminating information. So they looked at some studies on the topic of climate change, for example, and found that The Day After Tomorrow was too science fiction-y and therefore not believable. And because it wasn't believable, it did not have long-term impact on social behavior. So these are what the authors found generally about how popular culture influences change, social change. And then what they were interested in doing, and what they ended up doing in their findings section, was explaining how this happens in different mediums. So they started with television. And they said that television, and for our class, we'll talk about television series as well on Netflix or Apple TV or Amazon Prime. It's a form of television. It's a new form of television. But television is effective because it has this indirect contact. So we can see and hear the characters. It can elicit emotional responses. And this occurs through repetitive exposure to these characters. So longer periods of time than just a short film. We get to know them. And this ties in with the theory of parasocial interaction, which suggests that media can provide viewers with an intimate face-to-face association with something. So in other words, mediated experiences become processed in a similar manner to real life experiences. The authors found studies that have been done in particular on LGBTQ representations, such as Queer Eye and Will and Grace, and they found that these television shows increased viewer involvement in them, correlated, so had a relationship with lower levels of prejudice towards those groups. So television, in other words, allowed for positive depictions of certain identity groups, which led to positive attitude changes off screen, just as negative depictions on screen, stereotypes, have led to negative attitude changes. Now, in order for television shows to be effective, the characters have to be likable. So they have to trigger some kind of positive response. They also have to be typical or believable of the group of people for which they represent. And the stories have to fall within a particular scheme, frame, or formula. These make them more believable. And the authors go through several examples of existing studies. So they talk about Jimmy Smits as the first Latino president in the West Wing. They talk about Jose Hernandez, a Latino astronaut who received lots of news coverage and was seen to embody the American dream. We also see this occurs when we're transported to a world that we understand. So like Little Mosque on the Prairie, for example, very Canadian. It helps us to understand that concept. And our level of understanding or identification with the characters and the story affects its impact. Even though we can't suggest causation, so it's not the only factor, we can suggest a correlation between our exposure to television series, stories, and characters, and changes in attitude, positive or negative, depending on those depictions. So those were the findings coming out of the data that the authors collected on television. Now, the authors also examined film and radio. So they said that film can convey more complex ideas because it's a longer period of time individually. So while a television series could span several seasons and several years, up until binge watching, and this is where there's room for research on this project or on this topic, up to binge watching, you only had exposure 1 week at a time and you had a break, usually on the off seasons. Film, on the other hand, is much longer. We're usually in front of our screen for 2.5 to 3 hours, and so it's easier to convey more complex ideas. It's also similar to television in that positive attitudes on screen in film affect reduced discrimination off screen. And this is because we can see and hear the characters just like on TV. In that sense, it creates empathy. Now, radio, they found, might not be as effective, which suggests that there is some kind of a need for a visual component to create change. And this ties back into the experience of real life. In all of our interactions, or the majority of our interactions, there is some kind of visual experience. But in places where television or film is not as common, radio provides that contact, and it can have social change, positive social change in those places. Now, the authors start to look at the internet, and there's certainly more room for research here because the internet has grown since the authors wrote their paper in 2016, but they look at a specific phenomena or example. So they examine a study on kid presidents, and they found that this study showed that there's a greater sense of connectedness online. So from an audience perspective, we're still able to get that emotional response. And from a production perspective, it has a lower or low-ish cost when compared to television and film. Again, perhaps this has changed since the authors wrote their paper. There's room to study this here. The authors found that what really matters, and we're going to see this idea again in future readings, is repetition across all mediums. So if we see similar messaging on the internet, in film, on television, on the radio, that's going to create positive associations. It's going to reinforce those associations, which in turn will lead to long-term change. The authors also take a look at music and video games, and they say that music has been linked to social change. In particular, it's been linked to different movements, different political movements, and different social movements. I'm going to show you a small clip from this longer video from 2015 by the group NASA, North America, South America. It includes other artists also. So about 36 artists from both coasts kind of formed this group. And one of the DJs in this group said, before this video aired or shortly thereafter in 2015, after seeing all of this craziness going down with police brutality over the past year, I felt like I had to do a song about it. I know it's a complex problem. Policemen have one of the hardest jobs in the world, but there is a real endemic issue here around abuse of power and lack of consequences for wrongdoing. One positive thing that comes out of all of this, and something that's inspired me quite a bit, has been seeing young people rise up and let their voices be heard. As a child of a generation that was largely apathetic, it's been beautiful seeing people feeling empowered, speaking out, and trying to bring about change. As a culture of young people around the globe, I feel like we are more mobilized and politically empowered than I ever remember. So that comes from one of the DJs from NASA, Sam Spiegel. Now this video, as a warning, contains footage of real life events. It's graphic, it's not for the faint of heart, but you'll notice that the artists don't actually appear in the video. It was filmed in 2015 and started circulating again more broadly last year in June following George Floyd and the protests that were taking place all over the world. So again, we're only going to watch a little bit of it, and it's just one example of how music can be used as a tool for social change.
Pick up, big shot with a trigger, you send that boy home and as the bar. Pick up, big shot with a trigger, you send that boy home and as the bar. Pick up, big shot with a trigger, you send that boy home and as the bar. Pick up, big shot with a trigger, you send that boy home and as the bar.
Mr. Protect and say, listen my words. Hand up in the air, don't shoot, don't know what you heard. Listen my words. If you don't make it home, mama go and ball if I man get mad. Listen my words. Friends and family, them living in fear. This is so upset. Listen my words. My yard go and start carrying less than scared. One shot, one youth, one cup, one shot, don't shoot, one cup, one shot, one youth, one cup. Hands up. Don't shoot. Hands up. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Don't shoot. Hands up. Don't shoot.
Did you hear me calling? When I said I got no weapon, got my hands on my head. You came in like a bandit, claiming your town boys and blue. You had a mark on me. You protect and you serve who I don't know. Rulers of the gangland territory. My head puts to the concrete. I'm not breathing. Officer, pray you have mercy on me. Unleash the beast, so you do not know where you're gonna go when that pain hero. Unleash the beast, tie above the law. Stumbling below, you got far too far. Unleash the beast, so you do not know where you're gonna go when that pain hero. Unleash the beast, tie above the law. Stumbling below, you got far too far.
Police stand up for your rights. Can the system a go and let them up oversight? Stand up for your rights. You're lucky if you ever get visit 25. Stand up for your rights. Because the system a go and let them want move blind. Stand up for your rights. Because them keep on killing and get acquitted every time. One cup, one shot.
All right, I'm going to stop the video there, but I'd be happy to share the link if anybody was interested in watching it in its entirety. Again, the song is from 2015, and if this is a topic that you're interested in looking at more, either on your own time or as part of this class, I would encourage you to watch or start watching Hip Hop Evolution, also on Netflix, in addition to tracking the history of hip hop as a genre. The series also touches on the messages and the lyrics and the meaning behind hip hop and where it originated. So again, if you're interested in that, please reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to share some more resources with you. In addition to music, though, the authors also look at video games. So they limited their study of previous studies on video games to articles about games that involved human gameplay, so shared storytelling. And they found that violent games could contribute to outgroup prejudice and hostility towards outgroups, whereas cooperative video games had positive implications for changing and strengthening intergroup dynamics. The last medium that the authors looked at was books, magazines, and comics. So the printed word, essentially, and image for sure. And they found that fiction had more impact than nonfiction. And the reason behind this was this idea of transportation. So it was also about the level of narrative involvement. But studies showed that from books, magazines, and comics, readers, so audiences, were able to recall vivid scenes. It pertained partially to the frequency of exposure. So comics, again, like television series, span over time. Some books, but not all, are part of a series. And so we see a similar phenomena in novels or novel series as you would see in a television show. So there are some similarities between the different mediums and some differences that the authors identified. Then they closed off by talking about some of the limitations of popular culture research and of this research project in particular. So it's hard to define what we mean when we say impact or effect. This is partially because of the interdisciplinarity that existed. So the different studies had different definitions of impact, or perhaps didn't define impact at all. In addition, popular culture is only one of the factors that influences social change and that influences our life. And it can be difficult to isolate opinions before our exposure to a certain form of popular culture and after. So one example that I have always been interested in is the television show Sex and the City. I feel like that television show revolutionized dating and dating behavior, but it would be difficult to talk to somebody now, for example, if this study hasn't been done yet, about how watching the television show might have changed their behavior, because they might not be able to recall what their behavior was before their exposure. And so for that reason, it can be difficult to determine, if not impossible to determine causation. Instead, in popular culture studies, we talk about correlations or relationships, but not necessarily causation. So that's something important to keep in mind for your own research projects. Now, with that said, there is still lots of work to do in the field of popular culture, and it is certainly worth our attention. And the authors talk about some of the ways that we need to study popular culture. So they say that more work needs to be done in the field of popular culture, and it's important to do that work because popular culture can influence perceptions. They talk about how most of the existing work is on short-term effects rather than long-term effects of popular culture. Things to take away from this reading: popular culture can influence perceptions. And if it can influence perceptions, it can be an agent for social change. In addition to being an agent for social change, popular culture is most effective when it's likable, when it's believable, and when it has a narrative. So these are important things that the authors pulled out of existing research. Other takeaways for this video and for our class: it's an example of a systematic research review. So if this is a type of project that you're interested in doing, or a type of methodology that you're interested in doing, this project is one example that you can look to. In addition, it contains key elements of the research proposal for this class, as well as key elements of the research project. A reminder about what's coming next in our class. So the journal entry is due on Tuesday, February 2nd at 11:59 p.m. That's to be submitted on Brightspace. We're going to be meeting at 8:30 p.m. EST, which is not our regular time, next Wednesday, because there is a job talk presentation beforehand. And our next live class will cover a sample research project proposal. So thank you so much for watching and for listening. I hope that you guys all have a great day.